Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So I've been seeing this question pop up all over my comments on Twitter, even in some private chats with friends who follow defense stuff. Are Russia and Iran, with all the fighting they're doing right now, accidentally doing China a huge favor? And honestly, yeah, kind of, but let's be absolutely crystal clear up front. This is not about Russia or Iran fighting for China. This is not some coordinated axis where Beijing is pulling strings in Moscow or Tehran. Nobody in the Zhongnanhai High Leadership Compound is giving operational orders to Russian generals or Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders. That's just not how the world works. It's more like this. Imagine a guy who spent the last 5 years training, dieting, lifting weights, studying your fighting style, all so he can beat you to a pulp. He's got his game plan, his best moves, all his energy focused squarely on you. But right before he throws that first punch, some dude grabs his left arm. Another guy latches onto his right leg, and a third person starts screaming in his face from the side. Suddenly he's spinning around, sweating, exhausted, trying to deal with all of them while you're just standing there, arms crossed, leaning against a wall, watching the whole circus unfold. You haven't lifted a finger, and yet he's already breathing heavy. For China, the biggest payoff right now comes down to one single word: time. And I want to emphasize that word. Because in grand strategy, time isn't just a passive thing, it's a weapon, it's a force multiplier. It's the difference between being ready and being caught flat-footed. Let's be brutally honest here. For years now, the United States has been absolutely unambiguous about who our real strategic competitor is. Our own national defense strategy, the national security strategy, the Pentagon's annual China reports, the congressional testimonies. The threat briefings, they've all said it out loud over and over. In plain English, China is the only country on this planet with the economic weight, the military modernization trajectory, the technological ecosystem, and the sheer demographic scale to seriously challenge American dominance over the long haul. That's not fear-mongering, that's not partisan rhetoric, that's just reading the room like an adult. So Washington's absolute dream scenario, the clean, beautiful, no distractions plan, was simple: keep Europe calm and quiet, keep the Middle East bottled up and predictable, keep Russia sleepy. Weak and disconnected, keep Iran contained and under maximum pressure, and then shift everything we've got to the Western Pacific. And when I say everything, I mean everything: aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, long-range hypersonic missiles, cyber warfare units, space-based ISR assets. Billions in congressional appropriations, plus leaning hard on our treaty allies like Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and even getting the Europeans to send their own naval and air assets eastward. The entire US military fist. Concentrated right into the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, the Philippine Sea, and the bases in Guam. That was the plan. That was the beautiful, clean, frictionless plan. But reality, as usual, doesn't give a damn about the script. First, Russia kicked off a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and suddenly Europe can't look away. I mean, can you blame them? Poland is on edge like we haven't seen since the Cold War. The Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they're genuinely terrified. Finland just joined NATO, doubling the alliance's border with Russia. Sweden is in the pipeline. Germany, the country that spent decades pacifist and energy dependent on Russian gas, is now frantically rearing they approved a €100 billion special defense fund, which is absolutely massive for them. They're buying American F-35S Israeli drones, new artillery systems. They're talking about reintroducing conscription. This is a Germany we haven't seen since the 1980s. For years, and I mean years, we've been telling our European allies, sometimes nicely, sometimes through gritted teeth, stop relying on us for your defense. Spend at least 2% of your GDP on your own militaries. Stop free riding on American taxpayers, and then come help us focus on Asia. That was the consistent message from every administration, Republican and Democrat alike. Instead of sending their naval frigates to the South China Sea or their air forces to joint exercises near Taiwan, the Europeans are pouring tens of billions into tanks, artillery shells, air defense systems, ammunition depots, troop rotations along NATO's eastern flank, and logistics networks that can sustain a high-intensity ground war. And we can't just say, good luck, Europe, you're on your own. Because Europe is still our most important alliance network, the core of NATO, the foundation of transatlantic security. No American president, Democrat or Republican, can just walk away from that without creating a power vacuum that Moscow and Beijing would love to exploit. So Russia, by starting this war, just tied down one entire US flank, the European flank, all by itself. That's benefit number one for Beijing. The United States cannot and will not throw its full, undivided, undiluted weight at China. Not while there's a grinding land war chewing up NATO's attention and resources on the other side of the Atlantic. But wait, there's more, much more. Then Iran jumps into the fire, and honestly, this one might be even more directly valuable for China in a very practical, very logistical, very quantifiable sense, because the Ukraine war is brutal and bloody, as it is mostly burns through artillery shells, mortar rounds, howitzers, armored personnel carriers, and general ground force gear. That stuff is heavy, it's expensive in bulk, but it's also lower tech. In many ways, it's industrial age warfare, but Iran's actions, whether we're talking about direct missile strikes on US bases in Iraq and Syria, drone swarms launched by Houthi proxies in Yemen towards Saudi Arabia, and US naval vessels in the Red Sea, or Hezbollah rocket barrages in the north of Israel, all of these are forcing the United States to burn through the really expensive, really high-end, really irreplaceable stuff. The very munitions we've been carefully, painstakingly stockpiling for a potential peer-to-peer conflict with China. And I'm talking about SM-2. SM-3, SM-6 surface-to-air interceptors, the ones that cost anywhere from $1 million to $3 million per round. I'm talking about Fathad kill vehicles that are even more expensive. I'm talking about long-range precision-guided cruise missiles like the Tomahawk and the JASSM Air. I'm talking about ship-based advanced rounds for our Aegis destroyers and advanced air-to-air missiles like the AIM-120 and AIM-9X that WED need to achieve air superiority over the Pacific. That's the good stuff. That's the arsenal we've been building up for years. Specifically for a West Pacific showdown for Guam, for Japan, for the Philippine Sea, for the Taiwan Strait contingency. That's the inventory that keeps our admirals and generals sleeping at night. And now, Iran is sending in cheap as dirt drones, Iranian-made shade-type loitering munitions, the kind that probably cost $20,000 or less to manufacture. Some of them are even cheaper when you factor in Iranian subsidies, and we're shooting them down with interceptors that cost $1 million, $2 million, even $3 million a pop. Every single intercept is a terrible, lopsided trade for us, but we don't have a choice because you can't just let enemy munitions hit Allied bases, Allied cities, US naval vessels, or commercial shipping lanes. The optics alone would be devastating, not to mention the casualties. So every week, every month, the US military inventory for the Pacific takes another silent, unpublicized hit. Think of the American military arsenal like a giant grain silo. You only have so many bags of rice stored up. Ukraine pulls out a few dozen bags every week. The Middle East pulls out a few dozen more. Pretty soon, you're scraping the bottom, and the guys in charge of logistics at us Indo-Pacific Command are losing sleep, rewriting supply plans, and sending urgent requests to the defense industry. Now, I know what some of you are thinking because I see this in the comments all the time. We're America. We're the arsenal of democracy. We can just build more. We outproduce everyone. And yes, in theory, we can, but advanced missiles aren't instant noodles. You don't flip a switch and crank out millions overnight. Some of these systems have production lines that run at maybe 5, 10, 20 units a month because they're hand-built with exotic materials, precision guidance packages, and radiation-hardened electronics. Some of the most advanced interceptors take 18 months, 24 months. Even 36 months from the day the factory gets the order to the day that round sits in a naval magazine or an air defense battery in Poland or Japan. That's not a supply chain. That's a supply crawl. And while we're waiting, China's watching, counting, taking notes, and smiling. Then there's the energy angle, and this one is absolutely massive for China's bottom line, for their industrial engine, and for their leverage over Moscow. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia's biggest, most lucrative, most reliable energy customer was Europe. Period, they were selling natural gas through the Nord Stream pipelines, the ones that got blown up, by the way, and selling crude oil by the supertanker to European refineries. They were making an absolute killing. It was easy money, what the Russians used to call petrodollars on autopilot. They were comfortable fat and politically stable because of that cash flow. But after the invasion, Europe slammed the door like a bank vault. They cut off Russian pipeline gas. They capped Russian oil prices. They stopped importing Russian coal. They even went after Russian liquefied natural gas shipments. They sanctioned the shipping companies, the insurance providers, the port operators. They made it legally and practically impossible for most European companies to buy Russian energy. So now Moscow has a giant existential problem. Where does all that oil and gas go? You can't just pour it into the ocean. You can't store it indefinitely, not at that volume. You need paying customers and you need them fast. Because energy revenues fund the Russian state budget, the military, the pension system, everything. So Russia looked south and east, and guess who became one of their very biggest, most reliable buyers? China. And here's where the power dynamic flips completely, and I mean completely. Before all this, Russia could say to China, if you don't buy our oil and gas at our price, don't worry, someone else will. The Europeans are lining up, the Japanese are interested, the Koreans too, the Indians are knocking. That gave Moscow leverage. That allowed them to play hardball in negotiations. But now China can look Russia straight in the eye and say, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is the essence, I like your product, I really do. But I also like Saudi Arabia's. I like Iraq's. I like Brazil's. I like what the Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan are offering. I like what Iran is offering, even with the sanctions. So if you want my long-term business, if you want my pipelines, if you want my financing, you're going to give me a discount, a real one, not a token one, and that's exactly what's happened. For the past couple of years, China has been purchasing Russian crude and natural gas at a significant discount, sometimes 5%, sometimes 10%, sometimes even more, depending on the month, the global oil price, and the negotiation cycle. That's not Russia being suddenly generous to their no-limit strategic partner. That's Russia running out of alternatives. That's the market punishing a seller with no other customers. For China, a manufacturing superpower that sucks down more oil and gas than almost any other country on earth. With a population of over 1.4 billion and an industrial base that never sleeps, even a few percentage points off the price means real, hard, billions of dollars in savings every single year. That's not theory, that's accounting, that's money that can go into semiconductor research and development, into naval construction, into space programs, into social stability at home. And the sanctions story, oh, the irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. The West, led by the United States, backed by the EU, the UK, Japan, Canada, Australia, and others tried to squeeze Russia into a tiny suffocating corner. They hit them with over 15,000 separate sanctions since 2022. They froze roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank assets, mostly held in European and American financial institutions. They kicked Russian banks out of the SWIFT messaging system, not all of them, but the big ones. They banned the export of microchips, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, high-end machine tools, aircraft spare parts, industrial bearings, optical equipment, specialized chemicals, and literally thousands of other items. And what happened? Instead of making Russia crawl back to the West, begging for mercy, which was the intended effect, they pushed Moscow straight into Beijing's waiting arms. Now we're seeing more and more bilateral trade settled in Chinese yuan instead of US dollars, which, by the way, is a long-term threat to dollar dominance. But that's a whole separate video. We're seeing new pipelines being planned, the Power of Siberia 2, for example, to carry natural gas directly from the Russian Arctic into Chinese provinces. We're seeing Russian rail and port infrastructure being retooled to face east instead of west. Russian companies are listing bonds in Hong Kong. Russia is becoming economically dependent on Asia, specifically on China, in a way that would have been absolutely unthinkable 10 or 15 years ago. From Beijing's perspective, this is a geopolitical gift that keeps on giving. For decades, for most of the post-Cold War era, honestly, China had to sleep with one eye open because their giant northern neighbor, Russia, could swing back and forth like a weather vane. One day, Moscow was cozy with Beijing, signing friendship treaties and border agreements. The next day, they were chatting with Washington about missile defense cooperation. The day after that, they were cutting energy deals with Berlin and Paris and playing the European card against both China and the United States. China never knew which version of Russia they'd wake up to, but now Russia and the West are so burned, so hostile, so economically decoupled that a quick reunion, even a partial one, is basically impossible for the foreseeable future. And I'm talking at least a decade, probably more. That means Beijing's northern flank just got a whole lot quieter, a whole lot safer, a whole lot more predictable. That's one less front China has to worry about, one less vector for American pressure, one less opportunity for the United States to use Russia as a counterweight against China. But honestly, none of that, not the European distraction, not the missile depletion, not the cheap energy, not the sanctions push. not the northern flank security. None of that is the real jackpot. The real prize is something much more intangible and much more valuable over the long run: intelligence, real world, live fire, blood and steel battlefield lessons. And China didn't pay a single tuition fee. Not one round fired, not one soldier lost, not one aircraft downed, not one ship damaged. They just sat back, watched, analyzed, and took notes. Think about Ukraine. That war is giving us in China a masterclass in modern combined arms warfare. We're learning how drones, both commercial-grade quaders and purpose-built military UAVs, are revolutionizing reconnaissance, artillery targeting, and even direct attack. We're learning that a $500 FPV drone with a grenade taped to it can take out a $30 million main battle tank, and that changes the entire calculus of armored warfare. We're learning how satellites, both commercial imagery like Maxar and military signals, intel provide battlefield transparency that used to be reserved for superpowers alone. We're watching electronic warfare in action jamming, spoofing, signal interception, GPS denial in ways that we only simulated in Nevada or Germany during NATO exercises. We're seeing why air bases need hardened shelters, why ammunition depots need to be dispersed across hundreds of locations, why logistics convoys are so vulnerable to drone attacks, why fuel depots are prime targets, why bridges and railway nodes matter more than ever. We're seeing exactly how many artillery shells a modern army burns through in a single day of sustained offensive operations, sometimes 10,000, sometimes 20,000, even more. And we're seeing how long it takes factories to reload those stocks. Months, sometimes years. And that's for basic shells, not the high-end stuff. And then look at Iran. That theater is teaching us a completely different lesson. And this one is directly relevant to the Pacific, where China has thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles aimed at our bases, our ships, and our allies. For decades, we've sold the world and we've sold ourselves the idea that systems like the Patriot, THAAD, Aegis, and Israel's Iron Dome can create an impenetrable, leak-proof umbrella. We've shown videos of intercepts, we've boasted about success rates, we've used it as a selling point for allied defense cooperation, and against a few incoming missiles. Sure, they worked beautifully. 1 missile intercepted, 10 missiles. Most of them get shot down, maybe all of them, great. But what about 50? What about 100, 300, launched in coordinated waves, day after day? Night after night, using cheap decoys, swarm tactics, saturation attacks, and maneuverable re-entry vehicles. Then the math changes completely. It's no longer about can you intercept. It's about how many interceptors do you have left after the first hour. It's about can your battle management system process that many tracks simultaneously. It's about are your crews mentally and physically exhausted after sustained alert. It's like wearing a bulletproof vest 1 round, fine 10 rounds. Maybe you're still standing. 50 rounds, your ribs are cracked. Your breathing is shallow and you're asking yourself, how many more can this vest actually take before I'm on the ground? That's the lesson Iran is teaching everyone: the Israelis, the Americans, the Saudis, and the Chinese sitting in the back row of the classroom. And I can guarantee you, Beijing is paying very, very close attention. These 2 wars, Ukraine and the various Iranian fronts, are giving us, and China, a live fire battlefield simulation that no supercomputer, no war game, no tabletop exercise at Fort Leavenworth or Newport could ever replicate. Beijing gets to watch in high definition, in real time, across multiple theaters. Which weapon systems actually deliver combat value? Which ones are overhyped by defense contractors and public relations campaigns? Which platforms break down under sustained stress? Which munitions burn through supply chains too fast? Which factories can't scale up production quickly enough? Which logistics networks collapse under the weight of demand? Which command and control structures work and which ones crack under pressure? And on top of all that, China gets a front row seat to something else that is absolutely priceless: how the United States and its allies actually execute a full spectrum economic and financial sanctions regime against a major power. Not a small country like North Korea or Iran, but a G20 economy, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a nuclear armed state. They see the sequence in excruciating detail. First, freeze the central bank's foreign reserves, $300 billion gone overnight. Then cut off commercial banking from SWIFT. Then restrict the export of microchips, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and all related technology. Then block high-end machine tools the kind you need to manufacture precision components for cruise missiles and jet engines. Then ban aviation spare parts. So commercial fleets start grounding themselves. Then squeeze oil and gas exports by targeting shipping insurance, tanker registration, and port access. Then go after the maritime logistics chain, so Russian goods can't move through European ports. Then start secondary sanctions on third-party countries and companies that try to help Russia evade the restrictions, and they see in real time exactly where Russia hurts the most, where the pain is acute, where the Russian economy starts to bend, where inflation spikes, where production lines slow down, where consumer confidence collapses, and they also see where Russia finds clever workarounds, gray fleets, sailing under third-party flags, cryptocurrency payments, barter deals with gold overland railway routes through Central Asia. Shell companies in friendly jurisdictions like Turkey and the UAE, they're taking notes on every single move. It's like watching a guy walk through a massive, dense minefield every time he steps on one mine and somehow survives. Beijing marks that exact spot on their digital map. If they ever have to cross that same field themselves, and they know they probably will at some point, they'll know exactly where not to step, and maybe they'll even learn a few tricks on how to disarm some of those mines before they detonate. So if you zoom out and connect all these dots, here's the full picture we're looking at from an American perspective. Russia is keeping Europe busy, terrified and rearmed, which means America can't just walk away from NATO to focus on the Pacific. That's one front permanently tied down. Iran is keeping the US military burning through our most expensive, most advanced, most difficult to replace munitions, the very stocks we'd need in a high-end fight against China. That's a second front that's silently draining our readiness. Russia is feeding China heavily discounted oil and gas, which fattens Beijing's industrial engine, lowers their manufacturing costs, and gives them greater leverage over Moscow's economic future. That's money in China's pocket and leverage in China's hand. And both wars are putting on display, in excruciating detail, how modern combat actually works, how American logistics strain under sustained pressure, how our defense industrial base lags behind wartime demand, how sanctions play out in practice, and how resilient or not a major power can be under comprehensive pressure, all without China having to fire a single bullet, launch a single missile, lose a single soldier, or sink a single ship. That's the real bargain other countries pay in blood, in treasure, in years of economic pain, in shattered cities and displaced populations, and China sits there with a notepad, a highlighter, and a team of analysts getting the best graduate level education in modern warfare, sanctions, and logistics that money simply cannot buy. Now, and I need to say this clearly, because I don't want you to think I'm naive. I'm not saying this is all sunshine and roses for Beijing. There's a darker side that Chinese strategists are absolutely losing sleep over. If any of these wars spiral completely out of control, if Iran actually tries to close the Strait of Hormuz, for example, which is a genuine possibility, China, as the world's largest crude oil importer, gets slammed with skyrocketing energy prices overnight. That's a direct hit to their manufacturing sector, their inflation numbers, their consumer confidence, and their social stability. They can't afford that. And if the Ukraine war drags on for years, not months, but years, then Europe and the United States are going to realize just how painfully hollowed out our defense industrial base has become. We'll pour hundreds of billions of dollars. And I mean, we're already starting into rebuilding factories, opening new production lines for artillery shells, missiles, drones, air defense systems, and submarine components. We'll hire thousands of new workers. We'll expand our shipyards. We'll speed up our procurement timelines. We'll bypass some of the bureaucratic red tape that slows everything down in peacetime. Today, an empty American arsenal is China's golden opportunity. But 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if we've built a much larger, much faster, much more resilient military industrial base, precisely because of the lessons we learn in Ukraine and the Middle East, that could become China's long-term nightmare. A wartime economy, once retooled and ramped up, doesn't easily go back to peacetime slowness. The factories stay open, the workers stay trained. The supply chains stay connected, and that capacity isn't just for Europe, it can be pivoted to the Pacific. So China's real hope isn't global chaos. They don't want the world to burn. That's not their game. Their absolute ideal scenario is a delicate, fragile balancing act. Russia doesn't collapse, because a collapsed Russia could become a failed nuclear state, a breeding ground for instability, or get swallowed into China's own sphere of influence in ways that create new, expensive problems for Beijing. Iran doesn't fall because a weakened Iran would upset the Persian Gulf balance, and could lead to even more US military entrenchment in the region, more patrols, more bases, more interceptors, and the wars don't spin totally out of control because global panic is bad for trade, bad for shipping, bad for oil prices, bad for container traffic, bad for everything. China needs to keep its factories humming and its export machine running. But at the same time, and this is the critical part, Beijing absolutely loves the fact that the United States is constantly stretched thin, distracted, divided between multiple theaters, one hand in Europe, one hand in the Middle East, one eye on the Pacific, one foot in the South China Sea, and another foot, if that's possible, on the Korean Peninsula. Even the most powerful country on earth can't handle 4 major strategic fronts at once and do any of them brilliantly. When you're spinning that many plates, when you're juggling that many fires, sooner or later, something's going to drop, something's going to crack, something's going to give. And in the end, in a great power competition, that's measured in decades. Not years' time is sometimes more valuable than missiles, more valuable than aircraft carriers, more valuable than stealth bombers, more valuable than cyber weapons, because time allows you to build, to learn, to adapt, to industrialize, to innovate, to invest in research, to train your personnel, to wait for your opponent to make a mistake, to let their alliances fray, to let their domestic politics get in the way right now. China is getting exactly that time. Time bought for them by Russian troops dying in the Donbas and Iranian rockets flying over the Red Sea. They didn't pay for it with their own blood, their own treasure, or their own political capital, but they're using it every single day. We don't have to like it. In fact, I think we should be genuinely concerned about it, but we sure as hell better understand it, because the first step to solving a problem is admitting you have one. And right now, the problem is that our adversaries, and yes, China is an adversary, are getting a free education and a free strategic pause. All thanks to conflicts we didn't start and we didn't choose. All right, that's it for today. That was a long one, I know, but this stuff matters. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them, I respond to them, and I genuinely love hearing your takes, even when you disagree. Hit that like button if this breakdown made sense to you. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Stay sharp, stay informed, and remember, geopolitics doesn't care about your feelings, but it cares a whole lot about your attention. I'll see you all in the next one.